Greetings, everyone. Welcome to your affirming interfaith community, Swedenborgian community online. Thank you for joining us as we talk about Helen Keller's book, My Religion. We're wrapping things up, and I think it'll be a good summary of all the chapters we've seen before. So even if you haven't been following us throughout our book discussion, I think you'll enjoy these final two chapters, chapters 7 and 8, for those of you following along. And as you probably know by now, Helen Keller was a purported Swedenborgian. Swedenborgianism is an open, mystical Christianity that believes, although it's Christian, believes there are many paths to divinity, many ways to walk with God. And in fact, divinity walks with all people, uplifting them towards love, life, goodness, and truth. So let's just dive right in. And I love Helen Keller's writing so much that we are using an older version of the book called My Religion. But if you happen to find a version called Light in My Darkness, that is just as well. For some reason, they updated her language. I don't quite understand it myself, but maybe it's an easier read for some of you. And let's begin towards the beginning of chapter 7, when Helen really appreciates and engages with Swedenborg's idea that our lives are in the delight of what we love, that we're driven by all our loves to work, to get up in the morning. And so in a way, you can describe your life, or at least the heart of it, so to speak, by what you love. And she says there is no interest where the heart is cold. And where there is no impulse, there is no delight. And indeed, even if we feel compelled by someone to do something, it's usually because we have something to lose if we don't listen to them, right? Often that's how we might feel about our work, getting up early in the morning, what have you. There's all these compelling things that have their root in what we love. So we may not necessarily love taking out the garbage, but we love not having garbage in the house, and on and on. She goes further to say human happiness is composed of countless small joys. Just as time is made up of minutes and seconds, but few people with all their senses stop to think of this, and still fewer sit down to count their blessings. If they did, they would be kept so busy that the next harsh call to duty would seem music to their enchanted ears. So she even refers to it there, the harsh call to duty. But if we take notice of all the beauty around us, all the small joys in our lives, when we encounter those things that feel like a harsh call to duty, we engage it willingly with the joy that we've garnered and collected. And maybe within those duties, we may even find more and more joy as well. But as she says, often we don't think about it. I know I don't always think about it myself. But leaning into that, I think, is a healthy practice, and clearly Helen's inviting us to. She says we don't need to give up our natural pleasures to receive spiritual ones. Because although she's talking about religion throughout this book and focusing on her ideas about what makes life deep and spiritual, she actually has this emphasis on how the natural world helps to draw that out of us. And in fact, we don't have to give up our natural pleasures to have a deep connection with divinity and our spiritual self. In fact, she says we actually enjoy those natural pleasures more as we rise in the inner life. Now, you will find that she talks about giving up selfish modalities, giving up hurtful habits within and without, and that helps. But that doesn't mean every natural thing fits that criteria. She further says, as selfishness and complaint pervert and cloud the mind, So love with its joys clears and sharpens the vision. So yes, selfishness can close down our thinking process. Complaining, having this kind of bitter outlook, I think, can pervert the mind. But love with its joys cheers, clears, and sharpens. She goes on to emphasize, to really appreciate what she calls a reformer, someone who wants to impact the world and impact other people in a positive way. And she says those people don't force evildoers, so to speak, she calls them, into the right way, but instead skillfully combines discipline with pleasant influences that may soften the stubborn will and charm the sullen mind into right thinking. And we talk about this quite a bit in our community of openness and love, and rationality, I should say, that yes, we need to be coaxed, encouraged into right thinking, but it doesn't take forcing. It doesn't take to forcing, and it won't. Our minds won't be open to transformation if it's just stamped onto us, if it's pounded into us. Instead, as Helen Keller is describing, it takes some discipline combined with pleasant influences to pull us toward a better way of being, a better way of connecting and uplifting life within and around us. Often we forget that in our prison systems, especially in the West, but I think all over the world, our prisons aren't really about rehabilitation, although we often say, well, the best rehabilitation is just punishment. But we're clearly not interested in truly looking for ways to help people change. We don't have good tests and measures. We're not employing rehabilitation experts, psychologists for prisoners. I don't know what it would take, but we don't seem to care. We don't lean into it at all. And that makes living in our country pretty tough. Our country is in the West. I'm in Canada now. I think it does a little bit better in terms of being a prison state than the U.S., where I'm from. But it's still, in the West in general, a horrific enterprise that can often be capitalistic. It can often be investor-centric instead of transformation-centric. If you have a system that gets cash off of imprisoning people, why change those people? You want them to come back. That's how you get paid. And unfortunately, that's the reality. Something we don't always think about. But that's the incentive for those corporations. And it's sad because our society should truly be focused on helping each other out, even if we're being as hurtful as we can often be. Now, she goes on to further describe how when we want happiness, we need to take the time to stop and see those delights that she mentioned before, saying, experience are as countless as the grasses at their feet, or the dewdrop sparkling upon the morning flowers that bring delight. Those experiences are all over the place. And I think she's connecting that with this idea that to draw any of us out, whether we're in prison, quote unquote, evildoer, or just being ourselves in what seems like a holistic, good way to truly appreciate life and to find the light within, we should notice all these moments of delight, which we overlook. And it's funny because she keeps coming back to this idea of earthly delights drawing us out. And in the context of Helen Keller, of course, it's interesting because she was blind and couldn't hear. And so it's interesting that she puts so much emphasis on it. But I think she would say that because she seems to be limited in those capacities compared to other people, she actually learn to have a greater appreciation for what she does experience does for her, and can uplift through her, within her. And then she connects with Swedenborg again, her favorite theologian, as we found, saying, if we examine our delights, we often realize that we are self-centered because most our energy goes to our own private ends, our own personal motives, selfish desires. However, we will find more enduring joys through unselfish purpose in serving others and uplifting life in the world. I find that a little interesting, that she's saying, you might think you love all these selfish things in your life. You may believe that this is what it's about, whatever your private ends are, your selfish motives. However, she says, we will find greater joy and more enduring joys by leaning into selflessness and unselfish purpose in the world. And it takes some work. I think we all can probably attest to that if we're trying to work on it at all. And it's a journey of a lifetime, right? But we need to realize that it's a journey that's for our own benefit. And as Helen describes throughout this book, she believes that's the purpose of religion. Her own mystical Christianity, Swedenborgianism, is all about the journey towards greater health within and without, not forcing people into their religion, into our religion, or into any set dogmas, whether we call it religion or not, but uplifting the healthy and goodness in them. Yeah, we can share our experiences, like, oh, look, this approach to science works really well. Maybe it applies to life in these other ways, or maybe what have you, right? It's good to share those experiences, to uplift each other. This book really spoke to me. Like, what are we doing right now, right? That's what I'm doing. It's good to share those things, but to force it on others and to get upset when they don't walk the path the way we want is a selfish enterprise. It's a way of looking at them and the world as if they're not a part of us. And so many traditions speak to how we're all deeply interconnected, that we are all empowered by the same life. And even if you call it the universe or Christ, as I often do and believe, or Allah, Muhammad's divine inspiration, etc., you can relate to this idea that we're empowered by something greater than us, even if it's just called higher power. And sometimes we disagree on kind of the trimmings. Sometimes we use that idea of God to dominate and hurt. And sometimes that's what we just get from our parents or a tradition. But I think that there's a spark of love and life there in all of us. And that if we lean into the openness of divinity that clearly uplifts so many things, we will find the light, the life that Helen often emphasizes in this book of greater joy and happiness. She further has a summary of Emanuel Swedenborg's idea from the mid-18th century, describing how if a man with unlovely delights has the intellectual honesty to acknowledge them and earnestly tries to lift up his heart to something worthy, she says, he must not despair. Okay, so yeah, she's saying even if you're in the midst of the most destructive path that you could imagine for yourself, or something horrific, right? Or in the midst of, just bad habits that just seem hard to shake, don't despair. If you start to acknowledge some of your spiritual illnesses, if you want to call them that, or at least your selfish desires, your selfish modalities, you are on the right track, and don't despair of your life, which is often, I should say, the first reaction when you realize like you're being destructive. It's condemnation of self, condemnation of others, especially if we're not willing to see it in ourselves. We often project our judgment, our hurt and dominating aspects onto them versus saying, okay, I have my own issues, right? But we should have heart and remember to have heart, because it's good to remind ourselves of that. She also says, as fast as our old selfish fascinations depart, pure happiness will rush into our soul as irresistibly as strong air currents, which gladden a long shut up dwelling. Wow. So as we empty that space, as we rid ourselves of the hurtful practices, it's almost like we're opening a door to fresh air finally. That's beautiful imagery from Helen Keller. This happiness strengthens us, she says, and enables us to transform the circumstances of the world around us. As this air comes in and this pure happiness starts to be uplifted within our spirit, we start to experience it, to notice it at the heart of our lives, and starting to come out into greater and greater awareness in our living and in our feeling. She says we're strengthened by that, and that enables us to not only transform our own hearts and lives, but the circumstances around us towards those higher motives that we are experiencing, that we are leaning into. She says it is a mistake for him to entertain fears about the enemy finding a breach in his once broken ramparts. In place of each fear, he can build a new delight and stay his mind upon it until the ordeal passes. That is what is meant by a hobby in modern thought, I guess in her modern thought. And it is wonderful to read how many unfortunate men and women are being thus helped out of seemingly hopeless, evil tendencies into undreamed self-development, a heaven-given psychotherapy. Wow, that sounds like really good psychotherapy. I hope we continue that tradition in such a beautiful light. A forgiveness for sin is nothing but the wellspring of joy from above that fills the bruised heart when one has driven out wrong desires and evil thoughts and works in harmony with the powers of good. Yeah, and that's what psychotherapy is about, although I don't know specifically what she's speaking to. But I think it connects to that idea that she mentioned before around rehabilitation of the evildoer, quote unquote, being drawn out by healthy habits, by finding good things in their life to inspire them towards greater health, things that bring them joy, that are healthy and wonderful. And she says about joy is inseparable from the doctrine set forth by Swedenborg. In that day, his was a new branch of philosophy that seems strange after the penances of the Middle Ages remind us that Swedenborg wrote in the mid-1700s, mid-18th century, and the gloom of iron creeds. One of the surprises of his teaching is the universality of delight as a minister to life. His superb faith in man's ability to augment the happiness of marriage and to make the life of childhood beautiful is still far ahead of the timid distrust, the low ideals, and the stupid methods of imparting knowledge which prevail among us. In a word, true life is the heart's capacity for joy fulfilled. It's interesting because she's highlighting some of the trends in Swedenborg's writings to uplift things that we've only recently been leaning into in psychotherapy and self-care, which is uplifting the child, truly, right? And using the delights of our lives to spur us on. And then she, and I'll summarize, explores how God's life, God's love and wisdom is equal in all things and cannot be less fully manifested in one thing or another. And further, that means that God's providence, God's mode of dictating, or not dictating actually, because freedom is a big part of her exploration of what it means to have a universe, what it means to live, but providing the governance of creation. So kind of what we would describe as the laws of physics or the laws of science, or whatever we've discovered as science, that's a part of God's providence in all things, and God's presence is in each and everything, uplifting health and life, although allowing for destruction and degradation, because that allows for the freedom to have a universe, to have something that's separate from God, that can choose on its own whether or not to turn towards divinity, in a sense, giving our spirits a full range of motion, allowing us to turn away from God or towards God, get closer to God, turn towards God from this direction, etc., etc., which allows us our own life, inspired and given by God, but that's original to us, and not shared in an exact sense with any or anything else, anyone or anything else. She says one of the neglects which used to be pointed out was the exclusion of vast multitudes from the blessings of salvation through Jesus Christ. This idea, however, is giving way to a more generous understanding that God has, quote, other sheep who hear his voice and obey him. So, often we can get into those silos of my faith or the highway. But she saw that even in her time, there was a more opening possibility, a more open mode of being, to approach religion, to approach spirituality in a way that generously envelops others and understands God to be a shepherd of all people and all things. She says, he has provided religion of some kind everywhere, and it does not matter to what race or creed anyone belongs, if he is faithful to his ideals of right living. The one principle to be remembered by all is that religion is to live a doctrine, not merely to believe one. It's interesting, this emphasis on living out your faith, because as Christ said in the Gospels, why say Lord, Lord, and not do what I've told you to do? It's interesting because that's often what we do. We espouse divinity, we espouse our religion, and use it as a type of get into heaven free card. Whereas instead, it seems as though, to me at least, and to Helen here, that God, that Christ, that Allah is uplifting goodness and life within and through us, heaven within and through us, and we actually need to live that forward, because otherwise the heaven dissipates, because we're all about domination and hurt. Now, we can espouse hurtful ideas and not truly lean into them and still have a loving, gracious, beautiful heart, but often when we are in our silo, especially when we're willing to use our ideas to dominate and control, we're crafting our own type of hell within. And God, I don't think, ever forces you out of who you are. If you create a spiritual hell for yourself, if you craft a hurtful, murderous, whatever heart, God's not just going to snap his fingers and transform you away from it, because that would be destroying you. That might as well just make someone new, right? If that's the heart of your mode of being. Now, you may not have a problem with that. That's the thing. We often don't have a problem with being our hurtful selves. But as Helen says, we can find greater joy. So in a way, leaning into goodness, into life, is a selfish mode. Leaning away from selfishness is unselfish. That's funny. She says, we turn to warring sects when we're in our religions often. And where is God? Quote, it has been said to me, if there were a God, would he not have created man so that he could never sin? I think I've heard that before. As if anybody wished him to be an automaton. Not to be able to sin could satisfy only a despot. Does not the spirit shiver at such a concept? In fact, all denials of God are found at last to be denials of freedom and humanity. Never heard it put that way, but kind of a profound thought there, Helen. The living value of a belief depends not on our own limited experience, but on its benefit to mankind. And an overruling beneficence is the only teaching that ultimately justifies our knowledge or gives dignity to civilization. An overruling beneficence, a God, just makes sense out of how we are. Our knowledge, our civilization, our dignity, to the extent we have a civilization, of course. And it includes many gifts, but above all, the power of going out of oneself and appreciating whatever is noble in man and wonderful in the universe. It includes many gifts, but above all, the power of going out of oneself and appreciating whatever is noble in man and wonderful in the universe. Worth repeating. So to see the nobility of our fellow people, of humanity, is a wonderful gift, which he calls above all gifts. And I think to appreciate it, and if you appreciate something, if you're drawn to it, if you start seeing it in life, and that's what brings you joy. Remember, she's saying we can notice all these things that bring us joy, including the nobility of others, the shared spark of divinity through their eyes and through their life. Then we want to uplift it. We want to empower it. We don't want to force it to be like our own. But we instead say, oh, well, even my own goodness and life and healthiness and etc. is a gift from God. So why not bring it out of everyone? It's kind of like bringing it out of myself. And she says that actually brings the most joy in our lives, the most feeling of abundance, and an ability to give up fear, to give up the fear of the one who may hurt us, what we might call an enemy, and instead see even life in those hurtful people, and accept that we're empowered by divinity. There's nothing to be afraid of, even as we die, even as we're hurt. She'll say more about that in the next chapter, so I'll stop there. And Helen, she really appreciates Swedenborg. I mean, I can't blame her. I'm working with a community called Swedenborgian Community Online. But she goes back to Swedenborg's personal testimony throughout his books, which you can find for free at swedenborgiancommunity.org/explore. His testimony that God created the universe due to God's infinite need to give life and joy. In fact, what Swedenborg calls God's desire to be one with others. That God's love is a love that's so divine, so profound, that God created a universe that could, yes, misuse that love for its own purposes, all to uplift life and to share God's own joy, share God's own love, happiness, and blessings with others as much as possible. She further says that providence, the providence that we talked about earlier, God with and in everything, uplifting life, ultimately looks chiefly to our eternal welfare and happiness, and not to passing blessings only. So sometimes we wonder why this thing, I just hurt my arm, I was in an accident, there goes my car, etc., etc. Why these accidents, natural disasters, or even harm from other people? Well, God is looking for and toward our eternal welfare and happiness. God is got the longest view possible through our own hearts and lives. God sees through our own eyes, right? Like, there's nothing lost on God. God is justice itself, love itself, righteousness itself. All those ideas about God that we've heard that don't live up to that, something's wrong with them, right? God is all those wonderful things and is looking for our eternal joy and happiness. And so some things befall us to help us grow, to help us learn, and because freedom is a necessity to have creation, as we talked about a moment ago. In fact, God guards everyone's ability to act in freedom, she highlights. according to their reason. And with the ability to find true rationality and reason by leaning into healthy motives, unselfishness. That's how we can truly start to think more fully about life, to really see the underlying reality and how things connect in the external reality that we all experience, of course, and find better ways to increase our own happiness with life. And finally, the last thing I'll highlight in chapter 7 is that Helen Keller points to how I, have a wellspring of innocence and truth within. It's been with us ever since we were born. That's that thing that kind of warms you, that stays with you from childhood, which helps inspire us even in the face of our selfishness and deadening habits. And yes, we can be deadening towards that as well. Other people can be an influence on that deadening as well. What the traumas of our past, of our childhood. Often it's the deadening within us kind of spreading itself like a yeast, right? But instead, Helen is inviting us, and God invites us in all different ways throughout our lives to notice it, to become more peaceful, and to notice that innocence and truth within, and allow that to spread, to start to transform and relinquish the hurtful, deadening things, the selfish practices that are all too easy to just go full steam on. Oh, awesome. That's our second to last chapter. We have one more coming in just a second, but I want to take this moment to say you should subscribe and hit the bell if you're on YouTube. You should follow us on all the modes of being that you connect with others on. We're on Facebook, on Instagram, we're on Twitter. You can find us on podcasting platforms. Just connect with us and also share your voice. We want to hear from you because we're empowered by you folks. We are empowered by your perspective, by your giving, by your empowerment spiritually and otherwise. So, we want to continue this walk with you. We want to hear from you, and you can reach out to us through many of the things I just listed, as well as through our website, Swedenborgiancommunity.org. In fact, feel free to email me directly at minister@Swedenborgiancommunity.org. Now, for our final chapter, which I will say is largely a summary and just kind of a joyful exploration of a lot of what she's talked about before. Not in this last chapter, but earlier than that. And I won't, spend too much time on this chapter. I think it's really beautiful. So that means I want to read everything just to you. I don't need to do that. You can download this book for free, hopefully in the description, also at Swedenborgiancommunity.org, and read it for yourself. Chapter 8. Now, I will start by reading her, though. Once affliction was looked upon as a punishment from God, a burden to be borne passively and piously. The only idea of helping the victims of misfortune was to shelter them and leave them to meditate and live as contentedly as possible in the valley of the shadow. But now we understand that a sequestered life without aspiration enfeebles the spirit. It is exactly the same as with the body. The muscles must be used or they lose their strength. If we do not go out of our limited experience somehow and use our memory, understanding, and sympathy, they become inactive. It is by fighting the limitations, temptations, and failures of the world that we reach our highest possibilities. That is what Swedenborg calls renouncing the world and worshiping God. I will, of course, add that Swedenborg got a lot of his inspiration from the Bible, from Christian Judeo scriptures. Of course, he pulls out theology that's somewhat different from other Christians, but that's his source of inspiration. That's what he turned to, as well as his spiritual visions, which he believed were given by God. I love that first part of chapter 8 because, in a way, I think it speaks to the higher calling of this book, of her life, at least from many of our perspectives, which is the limitations of life don't define us, but actually give us an opportunity to transform. And being active with those limitations, engaging them, helping them to a greater life, to enter our life in a full way, and allow our hearts to bloom is the call of what it means to live. If there were other human beings on this planet that were way more capable than you or I, that could fly, see through walls, whatever, like Superman, right? We might feel like we are, handicapped or something. Or maybe that's how they would describe us. But as we know through our lives in the pseudo majority, I don't know where you fall, we have a lot of gifts, even with our limitations. Everything that you can define in your own life and spirit, you can say is limited in some way. But that's not the point. The point is the greater life to be had, allowing yourself to relinquish the voice of judgment within the selfish motives, and instead find the highest possibility, as Helen calls it. To meet our difficulties in the surest way, Helen explores, we must assume that we are immortal and that we have a divine friend who never sleeps and guides us. It's interesting to think about what it would mean if we really saw ourselves as immortal. Not fearing the death of the body, knowing that will most assuredly come at some point. And instead looking past that and seeing the eternality of our spirit. What would that call you to? Would you want to live with some of your habits forever? Would you want to turn towards something new as a job or at work? Would you want to connect more in community in some way? In a way, we may say, well, life ending gives you inspiration to do these things, to finally get with the habit that you want and live life. And I think that's still true because, as Swedenborg often explores, the next realm is quite a bit different. And in a lot of ways, we bake our deeper loves into our spirits in this life, and then we kind of live in those spiritual bodies that we've crafted for ourselves in the next. And so in a way, there's still a type of transition that calls us to change. It calls us to lean into our healthy modes of being. But in another way, knowing that we live forever, or believing it and leaning into it, as Helen is calling us to, actually gives us more impetus to lean into health, versus, let's get everything done that seems to give us, passing joy and even hurtful pleasures. Instead, we feel that call to change because it's like, I don't want to live like this forever. I don't want that to be my mode of being, a hellish body, a heavenly opportunity out of reach, just because that's how I've lived my life so far. It calls on us to change. And with these thoughts, out of pain grow the violets, the flowers of patience and sweetness. So realizing not only what we just talked about, but also that we have a divine friend with us helps us transform our pain, what Eckhart Tolle often calls our pain body, which is often our kind of thinking monkey mind and all our reactions to and fro, and instead allowing that part of us to grow into flowers of patience and sweetness. She says, and I quote, "The richness of human experience would lose something of rewarding joy if there were no limitations to overcome." It's interesting because this is a theme in Helen's book. Her limitations are not a punishment, as she highlights in this chapter. They're not something that she ever viewed as an accident either, which is an interesting thing for her to say. She never viewed them as an accident. And instead, she says they're used, all of our limitations, even our temptations, to open our inner selves. to dispel our ignorance and tear off our disguises, and to throw down our old idols and destroy false standards. In fact, she says our limitations invite us to find a way to live in a spiritual place, a personal place, less cramped, less hindered by the ever insistent external world, our mind's habitual mode of reacting from one thing to the next, and instead finding the vastness of our hearts and of our minds in peace and life. To end, I'm going to read a few quotes from Helen that I think will stay with all of us, that truly encapsulate her exploration in this book, and what I would say was the deep inspiration for her work in social justice and helping those who are limited in certain capacities, and also in even her socialism, her willingness, not a blind socialism, but her willingness and a hope that we could uplift each other more fully. You know, instead of just building our roads and having the police and military be, provided by the government, which means those things are socialist institutions. Also feeding people through a similar way, having health care, etc. It's interesting because those of us who often react against the word socialism, we often love the things that are actually, by definition, socialists in our cultures, including the military and on. And she says, when the sun of consciousness first shone upon me, behold, a miracle. So that inspiration towards all these ways of living life that we love so much from Helen. She says, the stock of my young life, which had perished steeped in the waters of knowledge, grew again, budded again, was sweet again with the blossoms of childhood. Down in the depths of my being, I cried, it is good to be alive. And that's one of the beautiful things about her story. And that story of, finding that she could communicate with her teacher. I'm sure you've seen it or heard it before. She explains and explores it at the end of this book, how, she was what she called kind of a meandering internal animal. She didn't know how to communicate in any way. She didn't think there was communication. And when her teacher encountered her and started showing her different words and finally got through to her by spelling the word water on her hand while pouring or having her hands under a water spigot, and also a few other things in that vein, she felt like a sun shone in her mind. And she also relates it in these quotes to finding Swedenborg. Interestingly enough, she says, it was but a step for me from the wonders of nature to the wonders of spirit. When Swedenborg's message was revealed to me, it was another precious gift added to life. I will try to clothe my emotion in words. It was as if light came where there had been no light before. The intangible world became a shining certainty. The horizons of my mind widened to bright destinies where the race would still be swift, the battle strong. Heaven, as Swedenborg portrays it, is not a mere collection of radiant ideas, but a practical, livable world. It should never be forgotten that death is not the end of life, but only one of its most important experiences. In the great silence of my thoughts, all those whom I have loved on earth, whether near or far, living or dead, live and have their own individuality, their own dear ways and charm. Wow. Helen has inspired so many people, and often we forget her spiritual side, we forget her social justice side. If you go to her museum today, you won't see any of these words. You won't see any of her many essays on her social justice, her hope to transform the economy. You won't see reference to her speeches in many universities, many locales on the same things. Her life's work was in transforming society and uplifting these things that meant so much for her, partly due to the inspiration of life as she found it in many different ways, through her teachers, through her spirituality. We can't forget that crux of what it meant to have Helen in the world, that inspiration towards helping each other, towards uplifting the downtrodden, towards open spirituality and religion. It's something that we each can find in ourselves in our own way. There are baby steps to be had, but I invite you to reflect within in the ways that Helen emphasizes today and going forward, to remind yourself of Helen's mode of being, using limitations for greater life, seeing the gifts in things that people often call giftless. It's not easy to experience that in our own trials. Who knows? Your trials may put Helen's to shame. I don't know. May put mine to shame. But if you lean into life, if you allow those things to not control you, to notice that, yeah, you thought them, but they're not necessarily you, to start getting a little distance from that judgmental voice that you project towards yourself too, that makes it so hard and anxious ridden in your life. And instead lean into that divine source, that spiritual sun shining within. I think this world would be a better place, and perhaps more importantly, to God, you will have shared more in His life, God's love, God's shared mode of being, inspiring others in your own way, even if it's just a glance of your renewed intentionality, that shedding of selfishness that Helen often emphasized. Helen gives us an opportunity to just accept who we are, accept the hurts of the past, and move forward knowing that we're empowered by a divine friend, that we have an eternity to look forward to. Nothing to be fearful of. Yes, we're called to shed our hurtful habits. We might be fearful that we can't. But even then, Helen tells us not to despair, to start acknowledge the ways we can grow, even if we can't quite change them yet. But start that process of allowing divinity, the life, the consciousness that you call you at its core, to start transforming those more external things that we've often grabbed onto and called ourselves. All right, folks, that is Helen Keller's My Religion. It's been a pleasure reflecting on it, finding peace through it. Please stick with us, subscribe, hit the bell if you're on YouTube, follow us, and share what books, what things interest you for further exploration. Is there a text that you'd like to reflect upon? I want to look at Swedenborg a little bit more in depth, so I think that might be our next book, one of Swedenborg's writings. But if there's something else that really inspires you, let us know at Swedenborgiancommunity.org. And most of all, go forth knowing that you're loved. Bye.